So my 2 times great Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about how I've been using my DNA matches to break through one of my brick walls. So unfortunately I haven't yet completely broken through the brick wall, but I feel like I'm almost there. So I'm just going to use my family tree, what I've currently been doing, as an example, but hopefully you'll be able to apply the same kind of methods and techniques to your own DNA results and your own brick walls. So if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button so that you're notified of all of my future videos, and let's just get into it. Okay, this one I have been working on like a lot over the last few days, so I'm feeling a little bit brain fried about it. I know that if you do genealogy, you understand what I'm talking about when you've just been like working on the same like problem for days on end and you start to feel a bit crazy. Anyway, I'm going to do my best to explain this in the clearest way I can. So the problem with my tree was that I was missing a 3 times great-grandfather. My 2 times great-grandfather is called Daniel Stewart McGregor, and he doesn't have a father, or at least for a long time that was a brick wall. First thing I'll do is explain why, like what the problem was. So I have his birth certificate, his marriage certificate, and his death certificate. I also have a few other little bits and pieces like newspaper clippings about him and even a jail record, but nothing sort of gave me his father. So let's go through the evidence first so you understand where I'm at. So working backwards, his death certificate, it does not list a father. Clearly the informant didn't know who his parents were. So I think that he was far enough removed. This was a second marriage for him, and yeah, I think they just had no idea who his family was. So working backwards, his second marriage didn't seem to have a marriage certificate. I don't think he was legally married the second time, or if so, I can't find it. All right, his first marriage. So this marriage certificate does list a father, but I'll get to the problem with that in a minute. His birth certificate does not list a father. It lists a mother, and clearly he was born out of wedlock. She was not married. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of background on his tree. So Daniel Stewart McGregor, his mother was Isabella McGregor, and she immigrated out from Scotland with her parents, John McGregor and Margaret Stewart. Isabella also had 2 sisters, Mary and Janet, and each of those 2 got married. Janet married John Mccoll and had a whole bunch of children. Mary married Joseph Clinton and had a bunch of children. Isabella did not marry until later in life. She married a man called Duncan McCallum and had 1 daughter with him, but by this time Daniel Stewart McGregor was grown up and out of the picture, so he really didn't seem to have anything to do with Duncan McCallum. So Duncan McCallum was actually ruled out as a possible father anyway. All right, back to the marriage certificate. What he does list as his father is John McGregor. His parents are listed as John McGregor and Isabella McGregor. So my thought was that Isabella McGregor was his mother and John McGregor was his grandfather, who probably raised him or was probably, you know, influential as a father figure. So I just sort of thought, okay, that's not giving us an answer either. Okay, so I'd sort of given up on ever being able to find this father. Like we were talking about the 1870s, and it was a long time ago. There were no records that mentioned it, and you know, nobody alive would have had any clue. So it was just, I thought it was going to be a complete dead end. So he was a sort of a brick wall with Daniel Stewart McGregor's father. However, DNA results. Okay, so obviously when I did my DNA, I had lots of different matches, and how would I know which of those matches belonged to the right line? I couldn't. But as I slowly worked through all of my matches, I mean, I haven't worked through all of them, but as I slowly worked through my matches, I started to identify where different people were matching, and I would make note on my account so that I knew where people were matching me. What started to get really interesting though was when I started getting matches to people with Mccoll in their tree. Now, if you remember, Isabella's sister Janet married John Mccoll and had a bunch of children. So my first thought was, these are descendants of Daniel's cousins, the Mccolls, so that would be why we would share DNA, that he would, these cousins would have McGregor DNA. But as I looked closer, some of these Mccolls were not descended from Janet and John. Some of them were descended from John's siblings. His sister Annie, for example, her descendants were matching with me. His brother Archibald's descendants were matching with me. And his brother Alan's descendants were matching with me. So these people, when I looked at their trees, did not have McGregor DNA. They were clearly living in the same area, but they didn't have anything to do with the McGregors. So how was it that I was matching with these Mccolls? Why did I have Mccoll DNA in me? And then it clicked. The missing father, he was a Mccoll, right? He had to be. I was matching so closely with all of these siblings, all of their descendants. I was clearly part of that family, or my ancestor was, right? So then I started looking much more closely at this Mccoll family because, you know, Isabella must have been with one of them, or I don't know how it happened, but it was one of the Mccolls. So let me tell you about the Mccolls. Duncan Mccoll and Flora McLean and their children emigrated out here from Scotland, just like the McGregors did. And the Mccolls had a bunch of boys. They had one girl, Annie, but the rest of them were brothers. And so I started to investigate these brothers one by one, trying to pinpoint which of them could have been the father, because, you know, the DNA might bring me to one family, but it was really not going to give me sort of a definite brother as to which one was the father. So I looked at all of them. I couldn't find any obvious sort of connection. Like, they all stayed in the area. They were all in the right place at the right time. They were all kind of the right age. They could have all had a child with Isabella. Some of them were married, some of them weren't, but I mean, that doesn't stop people, right? As we've learned from some genealogy discoveries. So basically I'd gotten to a point where I'd decided it was going to be one of these brothers. I was probably not going to know which, but at the very least I could say it was one of these Mccolls, and then I could trace the rest of the family back further, you know what I mean? I could go to their parents, Donald Mccoll and Flora McLean, and keep moving backwards, because at the very least, these two were Daniel Stewart McGregor's grandparents, so I could just almost skip a generation and keep working. And I did that. I kept working, assuming that it's a Mccoll, like, it definitely is. The more I looked, the more matches kept coming up. To really try to clarify this, a very generous McGregor cousin agreed to do a Y-DNA test. So this was a descendant of Daniel Stewart McGregor, just like I am, but this descendant had come directly down a male line. So I'd come from one of Daniel Stewart McGregor's daughters, and this person had come from a son and down a male line. So he took a Y-DNA test. And I was really hoping that that was going to give us the smoking gun that would really definitively link us to the Mccolls. Unfortunately, it didn't really play out that way. Y-DNA tests, they sort of hopefully bring you to a surname. Like, fingers crossed when you do a Y-DNA test, there's some kind of consensus, because obviously as Y genes are passed on down a male line, and usually surnames are passed down a male line, if you do a Y test, hopefully you'll see a bunch of similar surnames to your own. So what we were looking for was Mccolls. We were looking for some matches with Mccolls, and unfortunately those matches did not show up. But it didn't really show a consensus of anything else either. Like, it was a bit messy. So there weren't sort of one particular surname that definitely it should be a part of. I guess this is the problem with, it's not always perfect. It's not always two people get married and all have children and they pass on the name. It's not perfect like that. There's children born out of wedlock, there's affairs, there's all sorts of reasons why DNA goes all over the place. So far the Y-DNA test is not helping, but I'm hoping that as time goes on and we keep researching, it does start to yield something a bit more. At the very least, it seems to be Scottish. It seems to be a very common Y gene in the Scottish sort of in Scotland. So the last little piece of evidence that I want to talk about, I want to go back and just mention that I had another look at all of the evidence. So once I started really zooming in on the Mccolls, I thought I'm just going to comb back over everything we have of Daniel Stewart McGregor and look for that kind of, you know, link. I didn't think I'd find anything because I'd already looked at this evidence so many times and it had never given me anything, but it gave me a little something. So that marriage certificate, the one that lists John McGregor as the father and Isabella McGregor as the mother, and I'd always sort of dismissed it because I thought John McGregor's the grandfather, it's not meaning anything. I was looking at it again though, and I looked at the occupation and I just hadn't really thought too hard about that before, but it lists the occupation as boundary rider. And I thought that was oddly specific because John McGregor was never listed anywhere as a boundary rider. He was a farmer, a grazier, however you say it. That was his job. He was a farmer, you know. And I sort of thought, like, if Daniel Stewart McGregor was just throwing something out there, why wouldn't he just say farmer, like, or grazier? Why would he say boundary rider? It's just so oddly specific. So I went back and had a look at those Mccoll brothers again, and guess who's a boundary rider? John Mccoll. John is, of course, Janet's husband, and they were married at the time and they were having children at the time, which is incredibly sordid. However, Lachlan Mccoll was also a boundary rider. He was 19 years old at the time of Daniel Stewart's birth. He could have also been a potential father. He was unmarried. The reason though that I lean towards John, because one, I feel like if Lachlan Mccoll was the father, why wouldn't his name just be on the birth certificate? Like, okay, they weren't married, but there's nothing terrible about that. Like, they could have still listed him as the father. Why not? The other reason is that I couldn't help but wonder if when Daniel Stewart McGregor was getting married and they asked him for his parents' names, he may have just said John and Isabella and that John was a boundary rider. He may not have specified the last name McGregor. So if he said John and Isabella, the person filling out that marriage form might have just assumed that the surname was McGregor because he was Daniel Stewart McGregor, and you know, it might have just happened that way. So the name John and boundary rider plus the name Lachlan has never turned up again in my family tree. Like, none of Daniel Stewart McGregor's sons were called Lachlan or anyone else was. So while it's not absolute proof, I feel like the DNA got me to the point where I could pin it to sort of a certain family. Like, it was definitely going to be one of those Mccoll brothers. There was just, I had too many close matches with that family for it not to be. And then the occupation boundary rider seemed so oddly specific. Like, where did he pull that from? Except if he knew his father was a boundary rider. Also, it would explain why the name was not on the birth certificate, because if it was, you know, Isabella's sister's husband who was still married to her and still having kids, it would probably not look right to put that on a birth certificate. So perhaps that's why the name was left off. So I'm like now 99% sure that it is John Mccoll that is my great-great-great-grandfather. Like I said, there's still that tiny little like shred of doubt because it could have been Lachlan or it could have still been one of the others, but boundary rider, like. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. Do you have any like other avenues that I could take? And also, have you had like a similar case where you've had a brick wall and then you've been able to use your DNA matches to break through that? Like, for me, looking at the matches was one thing, but then looking at shared matches was another. So, you know, if I found one person with Mccoll in their tree, I often looked at who we shared in common and then looked at those other people's trees. And, you know, that's how I realized that I had a good, like, you know, at least 5 or 6 people minimum that were straight up Mccolls that didn't share anything else with me. And I just thought that's too many. It's too big of a coincidence. It's incredible. All right. I hope this video has made sense, and I hope that I haven't like rambled too much, but I've been right down this wormhole lately. I'd been neglecting my own family history for like ages. I've been working on the business and on other stuff, and I just hadn't really looked at it too much again, but now I'm all jazzed on it and all excited, and I feel like I am this close to breaking this brick wall. Like I said, I'm like 99% sure at this point. All right, that's about it for this video. So thank you so much for watching, and please do leave any comments below or questions, and I will see you soon in my next video. Bye guys.